Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. Mercedes are reported to have hired 2 new engineers for their engine department to try and bolster what has been a bit of a weakness for them since the start of the 2022 season. But of all organisations to hire these engineers from, it's going to be from Ferrari. Not known for particularly stable engines, but known for powerful ones. Will this work out in their favour? Very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. First of all, just wanted to clarify here the sprint weekend format. This was introduced in Baku, but just to make it clear, because the sprints we've had over the last couple of years have been different to what we are going to see this weekend. So qualifying on Friday is for Sunday's Grand Prix, just to clarify, and Saturday is a standalone day, which is just for the sprint. So the sprint is on Saturday, but also the sprint shootout, which sets the grid for the sprint race, is also on the Saturday, right? So that's what we're going to see there, and also for this sprint shootout, it's going to be mandatory medium tyre for sprint quali 1, sprint quali 2, and then sprint quali 3 mandatory soft tyre. Less time, only 8 minutes, which pretty much means you get one shot at a lap to try and get pole position. Okay, maybe you get 2 laps in. Around Austria, to be fair, it's a very short lap, so probably they could get 2 attempts in. Not my favoured format personally. I would want this to be a one-shot qualifying type format just for the sprints, but it's a standalone Saturday and Friday quali sets the grid for Sunday, which I think is better for reasons that we've discussed over the past couple of months. Wanted to mention AlphaTauri as well, because Helmut Marko, as he always does, is giving some very honest opinions on the AlphaTauri situation and the drivers. They're looking to move at least part of the team to England to try and align a little bit better what's going on with Red Bull and what's going on at AlphaTauri, because for the last couple of years they have been highly underwhelming as that sister Red Bull team. So in fairness has Nyck de Vries, been around Formula single-seater races for a long time, was brought into F1 pretty much because Alex Albon got appendicitis. Nyck de Vries stepped in for Monza in the Williams, did a good job, absolutely. Outperformed Nicholas Latifi quite handily, but fundamentally was in a Williams that is very easy to drive at a straight line around one of the easier circuits to drive at Monza. So I think the overrating of Nyck de Vries to some degree after that weekend was kind of mind-blowing to witness, as teams seem to be falling over themselves to try and sign this guy, whereas before Monza, no one was talking about de Vries getting an F1 seat. And I am surprised, to be honest, that Helmut Marko kind of got brought in by that, but he mentions on this podcast that effectively de Vries' future is increasingly at risk. Pretty sure that they said they'll give him another few races until like Spain, and I think he did a bit better up until Spain than he was at the start of the season, but still Tsunoda is putting him in the dirt. And then he had a really bad race in Canada, right? I mean, the mistake he made trying to hold on to that position against, was it Magnussen? That wasn't ideal, and even Helmut Marko says that Christian Horner disagreed with the decision to sign de Vries, and at the moment it looks like he was right, admits Marko. This is the full quote here, that usually they agree with the signings they make for that sister team, but not often do I disagree with Horner, but sometimes we do. The last one I would say was Nyck de Vries, and at the moment it looks like he was right. He was not a fan of Nyck de Vries. So, you know, it's quite the statement really to make. I mean, you'd have thought that if Helmut Marko was, you know, more like some of the other people in the sport, he probably would have mentioned a driver from a few years ago now that's either out of the sport or retired or something, and just made it quite simple to answer. Rather, he goes for the approach of putting his current driver under the bus, which isn't really a surprise. That's what he does. But I think it shows quite clear indication here that Nyck de Vries and AlphaTauri is not going to be one for the long haul. We've talked about Lawson, we've talked about even Alex Palou, and we've also talked about Daniel Ricciardo as being possible options there for that seat, and I'm sure there might well be others. Ferrari have a filming day today, and they're actually trialling some new upgrades here to the floor and also to the front wing. Some maybe minor changes. It depends, right? Because you never really know how major or minor the changes are, because you can't necessarily see under the floor. But apparently there are some important changes around a crucial entrance of the Venturi tunnels, taking a similar approach to the RB19. So funny in a way to me that, yes, Red Bull's you know, concept in terms of the side pod is still a bit different from what Ferrari have. Fundamentally, when they brought those upgrades, Ferrari in Spain, it looks a bit more like a Red Bull than it did before, despite the fact that they were always saying Ferrari, oh no, we're not going to abandon this concept and all this. But every upgrade they bring seems Red Bull inspired. We can actually see this on the front wing as well. I believe this on the right hand side is the older version, this on the left hand side is the newer version, and okay, it might not look much different. Fundamentally on the end plate here they've moved back this piece of carbon fibre, but you will notice that on the left hand side this Ferrari version is practically identical to this, what we see on the Red Bull here, which is pretty much the same design. So I'm sure they've looked at that and thought, you know what, Red Bull probably had that one right on the front wing, therefore they're making changes to that effect. This also some more kind of comparisons here. So this is the, on the right hand side is the older version, the left hand side the newer version. So the front wing in general, you guys can see the shape of it at the top here is slightly different to what it was previously. And also on the floor, if you guys look carefully from the right-hand side, the older version, to the left-hand side, the shape of the front of the floor seems to be somewhat different than it was previously. So they're trying some things out here. It doesn't look like anything major, but they're trialing this on a filming day, and presumably they're going to bring these upgrades if they can to Austria. Whether they're fully ready yet, I mean, obviously they've got some things on the track here at the filming, so they must be ready to go, you would think, for this weekend. We'll see if they help Ferrari because, I mean, the last time they won a race was Austria last year, and they'll certainly hope that they don't have to go an entire whole year without winning a race, but it's probably going to happen. Mercedes obviously are also working on some upgrades. We got some more clarification today from certain sources as to what upgrades these are going to be. We heard the other day that probably a new underbody, side pods, engine cover is going to be happening in Silverstone, which is going to be their big upgrades, and then Spa, a smaller upgrades that is apparently going to focus on the front and rear wing, with new versions of both of those going into, well, just before the summer break. So pretty interesting if this is the case, that there's going to be no changes, or at least no substantial changes to the rear suspension, which is something they would like to change if they could, but for budget or for gearbox homologation reasons, they probably can't. And that apparently is going to be where the development of the W14 will end. After Spa, those upgrades arrive, there won't be much, if anything at all, after the summer break. They might bring a couple of new things right at the end of the season, but they've got to realise that their car after Spa is probably about where it's going to be in terms of the ceiling of this concept. At least that's what Mercedes believe. They might still be working on some other pieces, and they might have some ideas for the W15 that they think, you know what, let's bring something to the W14 just to see if it actually works, especially now the correlation is apparently aligned. But, you know, they have to realise that next year is what they're fighting for here, and they can't afford to spend too much time and money and development resources on the W14 when, as soon as the summer break hits, they're going to start focusing on the W15, or at least after the summer break, because I think they've actually got to take a break during that period, as much as they would probably like to keep working on their car. Also, though, on their engine, Mercedes since 2014 had the best engine, hands down. Ferrari kind of caught up towards the end, especially with their illegal engine, right, 2019, or whatever you guys want to call it. Since, though, we've gone to this 5% biofuel engine era since 2022, the Mercedes has not been the strongest engine. At the start of last season, the Ferrari, the Red Bull were clearly stronger than the Mercedes. They reckoned maybe there was a difference of, 10 to 12 horsepower potentially between the two of them, which is reasonably significant. It doesn't feel like Mercedes really hit the ground running on the new kind of fuel requirements for the engines as they might have done previously, especially the dominant engine they had back in 2014. And also for a few years now since Honda came into Red Bull, it's been quite clear that Honda have had the best energy store, it seems. And in terms of battery deployment, theirs seems better than anybody else's. And also their turbo seems to survive quite well at altitude, for example in Mexico, whereas Ferrari's turbo has typically struggled there. Now, speaking of Ferrari, there are two engineers, technicians, going to be hired for Mercedes from Ferrari over the next year or so, and they apparently will start work in September this year, so it's going to be very soon, with not a particularly long gardening leave. But apparently they have succumbed to the flattery of the Mercedes team, i.e. we're going to pay you more money or something like that. An engineer expert in the design of the combustion changes of the endothermic unit, and a designer of the aeromechanical component of the turbochargers. So those are the two engineers, we don't know them by name or anything, that are going to be joining Brixworth and working with the high-performance powertrains part of Mercedes going forward, and expected to get to work in September. So, look, these teams, they make acquisitions. Engineers in Red Bull are going to get stolen away, as they have done, for example, by Aston Martin. And it's the same story with Ferrari and Mercedes engineers in the past. But it is quite interesting to see Mercedes attempting to bolster their power unit department, because it has been a bit of a weakness for them fundamentally. It's not been a major one. Their weaknesses have primarily been with the aerodynamics of the car itself. And the engines are kind of pretty similar nowadays, especially compared to the Mercedes dominant engine they had when the turbo hybrid era began in 2014. But they do want to level up their performance, it seems. Now, you might think, oh no, you don't want to hire people from Ferrari because their engines explode, which they do, even though it hasn't been so bad this season. But they quite possibly have the most powerful internal combustion engine, Ferrari. They've always been pretty good at building engines, and that's certainly been the case lately. Now, yes, it might have some reliability faults, but bringing on a couple of guys that know how to build their turbos and part, you know, the combustion chambers of their car can't necessarily be a negative thing for Mercedes, and I don't think hiring these people is going to make the engine blow up every single weekend, especially if they don't get to work for some time anyway. But I think Mercedes might be looking to claw back a little bit of advantage here, because certainly for the majority of last season, straight line speed wasn't there for Mercedes, and I don't think it was just the fact that they had a draggy car. I do think that the engine mapping was part of it, and they seemed to solve that in part at the end of the season. One of their high performance powertrains guys said that at the end they figured out a software thing to unlock more from the car in certain conditions, and that was a problem that they had, possibly due to the new biofuel and just figuring out the complications. Even Adrian Newey discussed this a couple of weeks ago now and said that back in 2014 Mercedes did a fantastic job and everyone else was several steps behind. Nowadays everything is very close. I would say there is 2 to 3% difference in the power. That's maybe 2 to 3 tenths difference, which is still big when the field is so close. Pretty interesting that he actually mentioned specifically that even right now he says that certain engines are 2 to 3 tenths a lap difference in performance. And we are led to believe over the last 24 months or so that the Ferrari is potentially the most powerful, then the Red Bull but very close, then the Mercedes, and then the Alpine a bit further behind. So there might be a couple of tenths a second per lap just in Mercedes' power unit not being as good as it was, which is a pretty significant difference, it's got to be said, when the field is as competitive as it presently is. So obviously there's other factors with Mercedes they want to improve, but I think it's quite interesting that there is clearly an intention to ensure their power unit is as good as it possibly can be. Whether those couple of guys they're going to bring on are the answer to their problems, we'll see, but nonetheless it's pretty interesting. And just to mention 2 quick things before we close out here. Firstly on Alex Palou, because I mentioned this is a bit of a rumour going around yesterday or maybe the day before, but now it's actually been talked about in some articles that Alex Palou is targeting a Formula 1 seat. I believe he's currently leading the IndyCar Championship and in quite a dominant fashion, very impressively so, for a driver like in a series as competitive as that. And he says that AlphaTauri is potentially an option, but he also reckons that a certain Super Formula driver, i.e. Liam Lawson, is a strong contender. So possibly Alex Palou to AlphaTauri. There might well be other options they've got to consider as well. And just quite an entertaining thing here from Alpine in classic Alpine fashion. After having their 5-year plan back to victory 8 or so years ago, they have now extended their 100 race plan, and Laurent Rossi says that actually it's going to take 120 races, and I'm sure in 120 races time they're going to say, well, maybe we need another 140 races or something. But in fairness, they've got that new investment, and apparently that money is going to go into the right places to try and make Alpine a competitor. But Aston Martin have definitely shown them up, it's got to be said, over the last several months. So very much enjoyed to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.